We begin the program with Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. Thank you so much for being with us, Senator.
Good to be here.
Let's talk about big banks. They control 44% of assets now, the largest five. That's up substantially from 2008. I know you don't like that. You'd like to invoke a 21st century Glass-Steagall, but the administration is not supporting that. What could you do now to reduce this concentration?
So I think what we do, partly, is you have to keep up the pressure from the outside. You have to keep talking about it. We have to keep reminding people that back in 2008, when the big crash came, that our leaders stood up and said, remember, they stood up and said, we have got to bail these banks out because there's too much concentration in the banking industry. They're too big. We cannot let them fail. And where are we today? They are bigger than they were then.
So if there were any bank failed now, there's no question taxpayers would be...
You know, the government keeps saying, no, we've now got the Dodd-Frank rules in place. You know, we're starting to work on these. We've got Volcker that we're starting to put in place. And look, I want to be clear. Those are very much steps in the right direction. But yesterday we had a hearing, a subcommittee hearing in banking, and we had 4 economists in there. And I put the question to all 4 of them. Is the too big to fail problem solved? And, you know, I got yes, no answers, and the answer was no, it is not solved. Dodd-Frank, if it were fully and vigorously enforced, would that solve the too big to fail problem by itself? And the answers from all 4 economists was no.
So more has to be done.
We have to take that seriously.
Well, part of it is regulation, and the Federal Reserve is the biggest regulator. Now, you're a huge supporter of Janet Yellen, who takes over in 3 weeks. What do you think she'll do as far as big bank regulation that her predecessor didn't do?
Well, you know, one of the tools at her disposal is working on capital reserve requirements. And a second part, very much related to this, is the bigger the bank and the more risk that it poses for the system, the way of imposing higher costs on those largest financial institutions. You know, this is where they talk about the systemically significant institutions. So the Fed, both independently and through its leadership of all the bank regulators, has the capacity to put more balancing constraints on the largest financial institutions. When I say balancing the kind of risk that they impose on the economy.
Do you expect that Yellen will be more likely to do that than Ben Bernanke was?
Well, let me put it this way. I asked about it. I asked about it in the hearings, asked about the importance of enforcing and the importance of the regulatory role. And, you know, Yellen is making commitments in the direction of saying she understands the problem, she sees the problem, she knows what the tools are. I'm hopeful that,
so that makes you hopeful.
I'm more hopeful. And I'll tell you why, partly. Janet Yellen's data-driven. Look at the numbers. The big banks are getting bigger, and they're taking on more and more risk. Our banking industry is becoming less and less diversified with every single day. We're losing the smaller financial institutions. There's pressure on the regionals are being lost. We're ending up with these behemoths that absolutely radiate risk.
You also care a lot about transparency. You've introduced bills to that effect. You're worried about the Federal Reserve's lack of transparency. Are you also hopeful or optimistic that that's going to change?
Well, you know, one piece on transparency is just introduced a bill recently with Senator Coburn. 2
of the most unlikely co-sponsors in the Senate, that's
you know, but it's the reminder. You find the things you can agree on. And Senator Coburn has been out there for a decade fighting for more government transparency. I believe in more transparency. The particular issue that we focused on in this bill are these settlements. When the Federal Reserve and others, banking regulators, anywhere else in the government, makes a settlement with a corporate wrongdoer, if they think that's such a great deal for the U.S. taxpayer, then we think they ought to be forced to make those settlements public. And when I say public, I mean put them out there on a website, all the details.
Right. Speaking of settlements, J.P. Morgan, the largest bank in America, has now settled for, I think, over $17 billion of fines and penalties. Is J.P. Morgan a rogue bank, and should Jamie Dimon be replaced?
Well, look, You have to remember, I come out of a background of bankruptcy.
Right.
And what bankruptcy is about is it's partly about families that have hit hard times, but it's also about corporations, big corporations. And what happens when they hit a really hard spell? And when they get reorganized, when new money comes into those financial institutions, there are a lot of conditions that are usually put on that. And among the conditions are that there has to be a new business plan here, a showing that the financial institution is not going to keep up its old ways. And that often means that the CEO is replaced
So in this
those
case,
financial institutions.
the CEO should be replaced?
Look, the real question is, do you have somebody who has shown that they understand there were problems in the past and that they have a different plan going forward? What J.P. Morgan Chase and the other large financial institutions have done is they have continued to get bigger and bigger and load up more and more on risk.
Let me ask one final. Do you think that the CEO of J.P. Morgan has that understanding, or should he be replaced?
You know, I'm waiting for him to demonstrate
But he hasn't
that
so far.
understanding. Not so far, and he's had a long, long time.
Right. The administration plans to name Stanley Fischer as the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve. You know, I know, I'm sure a lot about Stanley Fischer, a distinguished academic, the head of the Bank of Israel. Is this a good choice or not?
You know, I want to be hopeful.
Right.
This is a hard time right now for the Federal Reserve. This economy has not recovered the way it should coming out of this recession. And what we're seeing is the Federal Reserve has very limited tools. And in a world in which Congress is willing to act, a world in which Congress is not cutting back on spending, using the sequester to cut back, shutting down the government and costing the economy $24 billion, Congress is supposed to do its part, the Fed does its part. Right now, the Fed just has very limited tools with monetary policy, and it keeps playing kind of working with the one tool that it's got.
You like Yellen, I know that. You like Fisher.
I want to be hopeful
But
that
you're not
Fisher's
sure.
going to work in the right direction. I am not sure.
Okay. What grade would Professor Warren give Ben Bernanke, who's stepping down in 3 weeks after 8 years?
It's a mixed grade from me. Ben Bernanke did a lot immediately after the crisis to try to stabilize the markets, but he kept the focus on the largest financial institutions and much less on what was happening at the family level. But again, I want to be fair. The Fed's role, the Fed has limited tools and a limited role. In dealing with that crisis then over time, the Fed had a real responsibility on regulation. And under Dodd-Frank, it has missed its deadlines massively. The rules it has written have been complex and difficult to follow. And so it's a very uneven.
Right.
There have been places where Bernanke has done a good job. Regulation has obviously not been a place where he is. He has concentrated and done what the Fed needed to do to help bring under control the too big to fail
And you think
banks.
there's going to be a new day with Janet Yellen?
I want to be hopeful.
Okay.
I want to be hopeful.
That is your byword for today. Senator Elizabeth Warren, thank you so much for being with us.